This video is made possible by NordVPN. If you are online, you really must be using a VPN, and that's where NordVPN comes in. I know it's tempting not to bother and hope for the best, but really, those stories you read about people having their data stolen do happen, and you don't want to make it easy for anyone to do that. But using a VPN offers more than just security. For example, NordVPN lets you access any of its thousands of servers in different countries all around the globe. So if you've hit the end of your Netflix queue, simply try changing the location of your server and get access to content libraries that, due to licensing agreements, are only available in specific geographic locations. For example, most European countries have strong licensing agreements restricting which soccer matches can be viewed, depending on the location of the viewer. With NordVPN, you can change your country without even moving from your sofa. NordVPN is super fast, so watching a video is a breeze. No lag whatsoever. If you ever used a VPN and thought they were slow, well, no more with NordVPN. And you can use it on all of your devices very, very easily. Android, Chrome, Windows, Linux, and on up to 6 different devices. One account. Also, there are no logs kept at all, unlike companies based in the EU or US. NordVPN is based in Panama, so they don't have to keep logs at all. Great for your privacy. So take control of your internet experience right now with NordVPN. And listen up, because they have a special holiday deal for a limited time. Every purchase of a 2-year plan saves you 68%, plus you'll get 4 additional months for free. Go to nordvpn.com/VisualPolitik or use code VisualPolitik at checkout. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. And now, let's get into it. When we think of Germany and try to do a mind map of what this country is like and how it works, most of us probably think of a very cohesive territory, a country where the economy is doing well and where prosperity reaches practically every corner, a real superpower. In short, the powerhouse of Europe, a country whose problems seem small compared to those we can find in other parts of the old continent. Well, friends, hold that thought, because the truth is that this is not the real story, or rather, Germany is not exactly like that. At least, not completely. You see, although the division of Germany into 2 parts, a capitalist West and a communist East, formally ended on the 3rd of October 1990, following the fall of the wall in November 1989, the country is still somewhat divided. Believe it or not, we can still observe the existence of 2 great blocs. Yes, that's right. We have not gone mad. You could say that there is an invisible wall that divides 2 quite different Germanys. In this video, we're going to give you all the details. Friends, the former territories of the German Democratic Republic present some surprising and profound differences to those of the former Federal Republic of Germany that even today, 30 years after reunification, have not been completely sorted out. But let's start the story from the very beginning. After being politically divided since 1945, the communist government of East Germany closed the borders with the West in 1952. The only exception that allowed relative freedom in moving from east to west was Berlin. However, some years later, in 1961, the communist government of the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, in view of the high number of defections that were occurring, built the infamous Berlin Wall. Since then, the historic capital of the German Empire became the living representation of a division that conditioned politics of the whole world for decades. East versus West, capitalism versus communism, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. And not only that, that physical border then extended throughout Germany, in some areas in the form of a wall, and in others of fences surrounded with watchtowers and armed soldiers. And it was no bluff, because the soldiers deployed on the border had a clear order: shoot to kill anyone who tried to escape. In some places, the separation consisted of double gates, with central areas full of concertina wire. In fact, almost 1.5 million anti-personnel mines were laid along the border. We're talking about a division, a mutual isolation that contributed to creating an economic, political, and above all, a social wound. A wound that would mark the future right up to today. Think about it for a moment. Overnight, 44,000 soldiers from the German Democratic Republic were given the mission of keeping the German people apart. Their motto was to avoid any contact between the 2 sides. Evidently since then, even beyond the ideological question, the paths that both countries followed in all orders were very, very different. Over time, the existence of these two Germanies generated important differences, not only in terms of economic development levels, but also in social terms. Friends, in this video, we're going to try and look at the differences that even today, 30 years after reunification, are still visible, and that continue to condition the political, social, and economic reality of the new unified Germany. Listen up.
An unfinished reunification.
It's no secret. Just as destroying is much easier than building, so is separating much easier than putting back together. In the case of Germany, which is the subject of this video, the differences and peculiarities between both parts of the formerly divided Germany remain to this day. And even beyond the economy, perhaps the most difficult thing to equalize and integrate is precisely their different societies. In social and political terms, there are important differences between the two former German republics, and although it may seem surprising, there is even mistrust and suspicion between East and West Germany. For example, many Germans from the former GDR feel underrepresented in political and judicial institutions and positions, thus fueling a certain feeling of inequality. To give you an example, 8 out of 10 judges and prosecutors in the East grew up in the West, and no major listed company in the country is based in the East outside of Berlin, nor are there any of the large research, development, and innovation centers that underpin the competitiveness of large Teutonic companies located in this part of the country. What's more, there are even clearly marked political boundaries. In fact, using the election results of the right-wing populist party Alternative for Germany and the socialist Die Linke, which translates as the left, we could almost perfectly draw the border between these two Germanys. And not only that, if we look concretely at the city of Berlin, you can see that the areas where these two parties reap the most support correspond exactly to what was once East Berlin, the side that was under communist control. And the obvious question is, why? What explains such a difference? What is behind these differences that even determine voting preferences? Well, friends, the truth is that in general, Germans from these two sides still maintain different ways of seeing society and understanding concrete aspects of politics. An example? Well, without digging too deep, let's take immigration, and that is, look closely at it. The success of Alternative for Germany in the East has a lot to do with the rejection of Angela Merkel's refugee policies, which have seen the country open its doors to nearly 1 million people since 2015. And it makes sense. After all, East Germany has never traditionally been a place of immigration, so many East Germans view this influx with suspicion and distrust. That is, you may be more or less in favour of this type of policy, but when you have not had any previous experience, the fear, rejection and suspicion is usually much greater. Moreover, in the East, unemployment is somewhat higher and the wages are lower, so that anti-immigration and even anti-European discourse has a better breeding ground. Although the vast majority of Germans consider their lives to have improved since reunification, it is precisely the East Germans who consider themselves to have benefited the most. I'm sure this is something that doesn't surprise you in the least. In fact, East Germans who currently rate their quality of life 7 or higher have quadrupled between 1991 and 2019, reaching 59% of the total group. But hold on a moment, just because things have improved does not mean that the differences have completely disappeared. German cohesion is not coming as quickly as was thought, and now it is clear that the 20-year period that was initially estimated for handling this was far too short. Of course, at this point, I'm sure many of you are thinking, but Josh, what exactly are these economic differences that are hidden behind this kind of invisible wall? And how do they stay hidden? Well, let's take a look.
One Germany, 2 speeds.
Friends, the political field is not the only area where we can find abysmal differences between the two Germanys. The economy also shows a similar phenomenon. Obviously, moving overnight from a socialist economy where everything belongs to the state and there is no private property to a capitalist one is not always easy. Or rather, it is not always so easy to close the gap. And even more so when one of the sides was 3 or 4 times poorer than the other.
After reunification, less than 10% of Eastern businesses operated at a profit. Most of the new companies were not up to the standards of the Western market. DIW, German Institute for Economic Research.
Note that in 1991, East Germany had a GDP per capita 3 times lower than the West, and its citizens had an annual gross income 50% below that of their Western compatriots. And although those differences have since narrowed substantially 30 years on, full alignment has still not been yet achieved. The GDP per capita in the East is still 30% lower than in the West. Annual household incomes are almost 20% lower, a difference that is even greater if we exclude the public sector. In addition, unemployment is higher and the Eastern landers' income is no more than 60% of the federal average. What's more, an adult in the West has an average net worth of 120,000 euros, which is more than double the average of 55,000 euros in the east of Germany. In addition, the reversal of the population pyramid is much more pronounced because many young people have moved west.
The flow of investment and capital into the former German Democratic Republic was immense, but people went in the other direction. The children who should have been born there are not there. Christina von Duverden, DIW economist.
You see, no matter how you look at it, there are differences. And surprisingly, there are some very particular things in the East that are actually better than in the West. For example, the infrastructure. Yes, that's right, I have not mixed these two things up. It's better in the East. You see, when the two sides were first reunited, the socialist zone of the GDR had a huge lack of modern freeways. The railroads were basically obsolete, and basically all the transport networks were deficient. Precisely because of this, and to change this outlook, West Germany embarked on a multi-million-dollar investment program in the East, paid for by the taxes of the Germans of the former Federal Republic of Germany and also with European funds. The result was the building and reconstruction of 2,000 kilometers of new main roads and a completely renovated railroad network for which some 30 billion euros was invested. The checkbook the German politicians pulled out was immense. Of course, such an act of generosity was not without controversy. As all these investments were made, the former West Germany, the epicenter of Teutonic competitiveness and wealth, fell behind to the point where it had worse infrastructure, especially railroads, than in the east of the country, where brand new ones had just been built. In fact, if you travel through eastern Germany, you will see for yourself how many train stations are much more modern than those in the west, while the road infrastructure is also better planned and organized, as well as being in better shape. This is something that, by the way, causes resentment amongst Western Germans, who are, after all, the ones who paid for it all. But why undertake such a large investment in infrastructure? You see, the fundamental idea, in addition to uniting the territory, was to facilitate the industrialization of the former communist republic, and thus reduce the differences between the two sides, in economic terms, production, and wages. Something that has more or less been achieved. Okay, not quite, but at least it's something. On the other hand, the main problem just before reunification was what to do with the huge, practically inoperative, and very unproductive public enterprises in the GDR. Here, the only solution was to initiate a process of privatization that was by no means an easy task, and that had been ordered by the government of the GDR just before its extinction, through the so-called Treuhandanstalt, or trust agency. The trust agency was a body created in 1990 by the East German Council of Ministers and was operational until 1994. Its aim and function was to privatize or sell the more than 8,000 public enterprises of socialist Germany, which employed almost 4 million people at the time. The challenge they faced was the difficulty in placing all these companies and their assets in the market. Why? Because these massive and inefficient organizations were mostly oriented to trade with the communist bloc, and many of their factories also had obsolete machinery that did not meet Western standards. And of course, as the communist bloc was in a state of full collapse, the turnover of these companies plummeted to such an extent that they were plunged into a deep crisis, at which point the idea of ever becoming profitable again seemed a mirage. Therefore, one of the solutions they came up with was to divide some companies into smaller entities to facilitate the access of small investors in the privatization process. But that was not the only thing the trust agency did to prepare the country for total annexation. About 2.5 million hectares, or almost 6.2 million acres, of agricultural land were privatized. Properties of the Ministry of State Security were sold, as well as army property and assets of the official political parties. In any case, despite the problems, the result was that many West German companies ended up buying all or parts of East German companies to establish branches or production sites there, thus taking advantage of lower wage costs. And this was good in the sense that a lot of jobs were preserved and production was secured. The only drawback for the future was that these regions subsequently specialized in the lower value added production and assembly phases. In other words, the most qualified workers who research, invent, and create value stayed in the West, whilst just some of those factories of those products were moved to the East. To further illustrate this, in 2016, 400,000 Germans from the East migrated to the West, while only 150,000 Germans from the West migrated to the East. This is something that over time has perpetuated the differences in income and wages between Germans in the east and west of the country, and obviously also the GDP of the new and old landers. In any case, it also must be said that the progress that has been made is remarkable. Of course. Now, as you can imagine, to balance a country as poor as the GDR with an industrial and economic power like the FRG was far from cheap. Infrastructure, levels of well-being, reconstruction of the productive fabric, remodeling of the cities, etc., etc. So the question that comes up is, but really, how much has this whole process cost? Do you want to know the answer? Well, take a look.
The price of division.
Friends, make no mistake, the German reunification has been and remains a very, very expensive experiment. Hold on to your chair. According to estimates by the Hall Institute for Economic Research, between 1990 and 2009 alone, the former capitalist FRG spent more than 1.3 trillion euros. To subsidize the economic and social convergence of the former GDR. To give you an idea, this is almost double the entire recovery fund approved by the European Commission to deal with the coronavirus crisis. And that's not the end of it. It is estimated that billions still flow from the West every year. Now, what has all this money been spent on? And how has all this spending been financed? Well, here comes another somewhat controversial story, because much of that money was spent for very different purposes than originally intended. Something that those in the West did not find very funny. I'm basically referring to social services. Although the initial investment was aimed at improving the competitiveness of the East, for example by promoting the modernization of companies, it has been calculated that a large part of the funds have gone to other purposes, such as social benefits, retirement pensions, subsidies, and aid of all kinds. In short, a lot of handouts were given to the citizens. This is a handy carrot for any politician who aspires to win votes, but in practice, it does not create any productive structure that will serve to improve sustainability, autonomy, and living conditions in the future. And of course, those in the west of Germany began to complain, and rightly so, that their compatriots in the east were becoming dependent on these handouts, at the expense of companies and taxpayers in the west. Sanctions were even demanded for eastern landers, who did not spend the money properly. This was never enforced. The point is that they have many reasons to be angry, because a good part of the money that eastern Germany has received since 1995 has been financed by a solidarity tax, or rather a surcharge, popularly known as the Soli. Well, this surcharge, the Soli, has collected 331 billion euros since its creation in 1995 through a 5.5% surcharge added to all income tax, capital gains tax, and corporate tax payments above a certain income threshold. According to the calculations of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, without this tax, the average income would save about 900 euros per year. That's something that those in the West will experience soon, as it is a tax that will disappear in 2021.
German government moves to end solidarity tax for Eastern Germany.
So there you have it. German reunification has cost a lot of money, yet there are still important economic, political, and social differences. Today, that invisible wall that separates the East from the West still seems very much in place, and you can also see how it is much easier to divide than put back together. But having said that, it's your turn. Do you think that both parts of Germany will be completely homogenous one day? Leave us your answers here below in the comments. And if you liked this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss anything new that's coming up. Take care, until next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.